The Semitist Michael S. Heiser did his PhD thesis on the divine beings of the Bible, and he has spent his academic career specializing in the subject. He's well recognized as a leading scholar of ancient Israelite divine council theology. In this video, I'll be presenting Heiser's case that the snake in Genesis 3 wasn't a literal snake, but a serpentine divine being. The first step to understanding what Genesis 3 is doing with the serpent is to look at the word the author selects for the creature. So Heiser begins by examining this word nachash, spelled nun chet shin. There are actually three different ideas that can be circumscribed by these consonants. If we supply the vowels forming a noun, it refers to a snake. However, as a verb, nun chet shin forms the root of a word for deception or divination. Switching the vowels to get nochesh, you would get the diviner. Third, as an adjective, the word nachash could substantively mean the shining one. It's the root adjective for the noun nachoshet, which 140 times in the Bible is specifically used of brass, a shiny metal. In 1 Chronicles 4:12 we read of Ir Nachash, the city of brass. Or for example, Moses is raising up the Nachash HaNachoshtan, the bronze serpent in the desert. Heiser believes Genesis 3 is using a triple entendre. It looks like with the serpent in Genesis, all three connotations are at play. The serpent is a deceiver and seems to hold certain divine knowledge, but we often also don't realize how frequently divine beings in the Bible are also described as shining or luminous. For example, our English word Lucifer is the Latin Vulgate translation of a Hebrew term meaning light bringer, sometimes translated day star in Isaiah 14:12. In Daniel 10:6, a derivation of Nachash is even used to describe the gleaming appearance of a divine being. Again, in Ezekiel 1:7, we read that the cherubim divine beings, quote, gleamed like polished brass. Our next point of interest is Isaiah 6. This is where things start getting interesting. Isaiah describes a terrifying vision he had of the throne of God, and around that throne, vocally praising God, were winged creatures called seraphim. In Hebrew, the lemma seraph literally means he burns or it burns, often translated as fiery, again putting us in touch with this connotation of luminosity. But strange enough, seraph is also a run-of-the-mill noun for snake. In fact, the Hebrew noun derives from the identical Egyptian noun for snake. What makes the case of the seraphim in Isaiah so interesting, however, is that in the archaeological record we actually have Judean drawings of these creatures from Isaiah's period. So what you're looking at here are Hebrew engraved seals that have been collected into a book by the great Swiss scholar Othmar Kiel. There's one of these seals, however, that is especially significant to our investigation. Benjamin Sommer at Jewish Theological Seminary has specialized in biblical texts describing theophanies like Isaiah 6. He states that this seal, quote, portrays Yahweh symbolically as a sun disk wearing a crown, a typical representation in Israelite Judean art. Yahweh is thus portrayed as king, and surrounding him are the seraphs. Quote, the text on this seal states that it belongs to a courtier of King Ahaz named Ashna. In light of the similarity between the seal and Isaiah 6, it is worth noting that Jerusalem in the 8th century was a very small town, that both Isaiah and Ashna lived during the reign of King Ahaz, and that Isaiah enjoyed very close connections to the royal court in which Ashna served. See Isaiah 7-9. Consequently, it is inconceivable that Isaiah and Ashna did not know each other. So due to the linguistic evidence, the function of the seraphim, and the fact that we have in the archaeology a depiction of these creatures belonging to one of Isaiah's co-workers, scholars have established that the divine beings praising God upon his throne in Isaiah were probably serpentine. Snakes were often positively associated in ancient desert culture with divinity and wisdom for many reasons. Specifically, their ability to shed their skin was taken in the biblical world as a symbol of rejuvenation, and consequently of immortality. Still, by the time that the ancient Jewish book of Enoch was written, which is quoted occasionally in the New Testament, we read of, quote, Gabriel, one of the holy angels who is in charge of paradise, the serpents, and the cherubim. Later, Enoch 61:10 and 71:7 says that the seraphim and cherubim surround God's throne, suggesting that he's using the word serpents and seraphim interchangeably between these two passages. Heiser also points us to an ancient Aramaic scroll discovered among the Dead Sea Scriptures, the Visions of Amram. From these fragmented pieces, we read of an ancient vision attributed to the father of Moses. In his sleep, he saw entities called Watchers, contesting over his soul. One announces himself as the angel Michael, The other was the Prince of Darkness. Under his dark cloak he was, quote, terrifying in his appearance, like a serpent, his visage like a viper. So what scholars like Heiser are trying to get at is that this entity we call Lucifer, Helel ben Shachar as Isaiah calls him, was taxonomically a type of serpentine divine being associated with Yahweh's court. With these features in mind, let's look at the Bible's two main passages purported to describe this entity Lucifer, Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. To begin, all four of these passages take place in a divine council context. Genesis 3 takes place in Eden, the original mountain headquarters of the divine council. Ezekiel 28:13 also says that this adversary was, quote, in Eden, the garden of God, the mountain of God, and speaks of this rebel wanting to seize its throne. In Isaiah, Lucifer says, quote, I will sit on the mountain of assembly, on the summit of Zaphon. Again, in the Bible, Zaphon, or Zephanu in the Ugaritic text, was God's mountain abode, the meeting place of the divine council. Finally, Isaiah 6 depicts God's throne room, the helm of the divine council. In all of these passages, the divine being is capable of speech. Now look at the titles of this creature. In Genesis 3 we have the serpent, the diviner, the shining one. In Ezekiel 28, the divine rebel is called a cherub, which Ezekiel says in chapter 1 gleam like polished brass. Again, that word nachoshet. Also, this creature is said to be covered in all sorts of precious gems, including gold. Again, there is a possible connotation of gleaming, much like other gleaming divine beings covered in jewels and metals like the entity in Daniel 10:6. Now there is an important aside here. Heiser believes that this word cherub would have conceptually circumscribed the seraphim. That is, the Mesopotamia word cherub is primarily a blanket term for a divine throne guardian. It describes a job function, not the physical characteristics of a creature, which is why cherub in the ancient Near East were characterized by their zoological fluidity. Just flip through the images in Keel's book. The only thing that's physically uniform about them are the wings. A seraph, however, is a particular subset of Egyptian-originating throne guardian described by its physical characteristics. Like the Genesis serpent, Ezekiel also refers to the wisdom of this creature. Finally, drawing on the Semitic H.J. Van Dyke, Heiser points out that we may have a little bit of other evidence in Ezekiel's description of this creature as a, quote, sealer of perfection. This phrase has proven a major headache for scholars to translate, but Van Dyke has proposed, on the basis that the morphology is unusual for the active participle, that we might have a rare case of what's called an enclitic mem here, something which does occur in 3 other places in Ezekiel. He therefore thinks that the final consonant in this phrase is supposed to be silent, which would give us the Semitic word for serpent. You are a serpent of perfection. This is speculative, but it's an interesting possibility. Moving on to Isaiah 14, we see that this divine being is called the Shining One. Then, with the seraphim in Isaiah, we have fiery serpents. You can see some more conceptual crossover here in the fact that Ezekiel calls this entity a shielding cherub. In the context of a throne guardian, this seems similar to the seraphim who cover themselves with their wings. Then you have the fact that the sin of the creatures in both Isaiah and Ezekiel is that they are explicitly said to have coveted the throne of God. And again, the seraphim were associated with the throne. To be fair, the serpent in the Genesis 3 episode isn't explicitly said to covet the throne of God, but he does tempt humanity by implying that God lied to them, and that they should disobey him so that they might become like one of the gods. You wouldn't guess it, but possibly the most controversial element of Heiser's case is the inclusion of Ezekiel 28. Most scholars think that Ezekiel 28's shielding cherub who wanted to sit in the seat of God is actually a poetic description of Adam, not Lucifer. Heiser's position on this passage is therefore a minority view, but this is his field of expertise, so he's got some formidable reasons for dissenting. Without getting into the deeper grammatical issues with this passage, what are some general reasons for thinking that Ezekiel is describing Lucifer and not Adam? First, we know that Isaiah 14 is speaking of a divine being, and in that passage the rebel says, quote, "Higher than the stars of God I will set my throne. I will sit on the mount of assembly." Though we could say Adam was metaphorically vying for God's throne when he ate of the tree, no text explicitly describes his sin in this way. In Ezekiel 28, however, we read of the prince who's being analogized to this rebel saying to himself that he, quote, sits enthroned like God, or a god.
The rebel in Ezekiel 28 also sinned because he was, quote, filled with violence and became prideful because of his beauty. As Heiser asks, where is Adam portrayed as violent or prideful of his beauty in Genesis 3? We also have the fact that this individual is called a cherub and that he was, quote, cast to the ground in Ezekiel. We could call Adam a cherub in the sense that he was to guard the garden, and we could say that he was metaphorically cast down to the ground, but it seems more methodologically sound to parallel these words with Isaiah's literal divine being, who is also, quote, fell to the ground, in verse 16. Finally, both Ezekiel and Isaiah end with strikingly similar words, quote, I have made you an object for kings to stare at, and they who behold you stare. Together, all these data points indicate that Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 are parallel allusions to an ancient legend about the fall of a literal, prideful cherub.
In his own analysis independent of Heiser and Van Dyke's work, Ronning's doctoral thesis reaches the same conclusion that the Genesis serpent is, quote, an evil version of a cherub. The respected Hebraist Bernard F. Bateau likewise observes this connection with the seraphim. I believe we can now unveil why the villain in Eden was a snake. Genesis 3:15 states, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Most Christians have no problem taking these lines as metaphorical, as referring to more than just merely women disliking snakes. The trouble for us comes with the serpent's curse that immediately precedes these lines. Cursed are you more than all beasts, and more than all living in the field. Upon your belly you shall go, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. Surely the words before this had some symbolic meaning, but how could these lines refer to anything but literal snakes? But wait a moment. In the ancient Near East, the concept of being brought down to earth and dwelling in the dust may indicate more profound connections. In Canaanite dialects and in the Bible, this term earth, aretz, can refer to the underworld. If you read Gilgamesh in high school, you might remember that its underworld was called the House of Dust, where, quote, dust is their food and clay their meat. The Bible also shares this connection of Sheol with being brought down into the dust. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the final parallel that Heiser wants to convince us of. Genesis 3, you will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. Ezekiel 28, I will cast you from the mountain of God. And Ezekiel point blank calls this mountain Eden. I threw you to the ground. I made you a spectacle before kings. It's also said in verse 8 to the king of Tyre being compared to the Edenic cherub that he will be brought down to Sheol. So here being cast to the ground is used as a synonymous concept of being brought down to Sheol. In Isaiah 14, how you have fallen from heaven, Lucifer, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the ground. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven over the stars of God. I will ascend above the height of the clouds. I will be as the Most High. But you will be brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. Again, notice how the phrase being cut down to the ground is being used in parallel to being, quote, brought down to Sheol. If Lucifer was supposedly just piloting a literal snake, why would God curse literal snakes to crawl on their belly instead of Lucifer, who actually committed the crime? But suppose God is actually cursing Lucifer in this passage, and not just literal snakes. To crawl on his belly and eat dust? Why is he walking around on his feet in the desert with Jesus in the New Testament? A figurative interpretation is the only one that seems to make any sense. When we unite all the pieces, the conclusion seems to emerge that Lucifer was a beautiful and luminous cherub. The serpentine body he was created with was a stock ancient Near Eastern symbol of his often mentioned wisdom, and especially of his original divinity. He was originally a privileged member of God's mountain. This explains why Eve could just strike up a conversation with him as if nothing's out of the ordinary. She had seen these anthropoid, intelligent serpentine beings coming and going on a daily basis. But this exalted being was punished for his rebellion. He can still bite, but his fate is sealed. One day a child of Eve would crush his head.